Hi everyone, welcome to science class, and today I'll be taking a look at the continental shelf and some environments that are found in this specific area of the ocean. This is loosely based on chapter 13 of Marine Biology by Castro. And first we ought to take a look at the definition of the continental shelf. The continental shelf is a submerged edge of a continental plate, and it's also called in pink here, the subtidal zone. Subtidal zone for benthos organisms. It extends from the low tide, so that's right there, the low tide to the shelf break. The shelf break is right when, like the continental shelf is going to be fairly shallow compared to the drop right here. Right there, and the angle turns in pretty quickly. So this is the continental shelf right there, and we're going to see that that's a very specific region where the temperature of the water is cooler than it is down deep. So organisms need to be especially well adapted to live in that environment. The slope of the continental shelf is normally more gradual than the shelf break, which is right there when it starts to turn, and that is steeper right there at the beginning here. Okay, so that's just like the continental shelf, and those areas, they actually have different types of life in there compared to other parts of the ocean. So here's the slope of the shelf, the depth of the water at the shelf break, and the distance of the shelf break from the shore varies greatly by location. They say that in Florida, you could actually walk out for quite some time before before the water gets so deep, so you can keep walking out. But if you've ever been to a California beach, man, some of those, sometimes you just walk out maybe 50 feet and then it drops off all of a sudden. Even more so if you could see it from a grander scale. There are mountains right next to the California coast here between San Francisco and Los Angeles, and the mountains come right up to the ocean, and the drop is so sudden that there is no basically continental shelf right there, and that's why you see just a little bit of white color right there. Over here in the Gulf states, Florida, out by North Carolina, Virginia, you have a larger continental shelf region. It says here that the average depth is around 500 feet, and the width of the continental shelf is a little more than half a mile. To look at this one, up to 470 miles. That's like almost 500 miles out. So you can see that to be areas like this right here. The average is only 50 miles out, but some areas go out 10 times more than that. So that's a continental shelf area. The continental shelf is an important area because as far as natural resources, this is where you get your oil and your gas. And if you've ever driven up the California coast or the Texas coast, you could see oil rigs out there. The Louisiana coast, you can see all those oil rigs out there in the ocean. So there is also an area of potential natural resources such as oil and natural gas. For this reason, nations want to protect these resources from exploitation by other nations. In the 1950s, the United Nations agreed that each nation shall have control over the marine resources out to 200 nautical miles off their coast. This includes the continental shelf and its resources. So this is called the economic zone, EEZ, and so you can see from 200 nautical miles out from the coast of all these different parts of the United States. Now this makes sense. This is the West Coast, this is the Gulf Coast, and then this is the West Coast, this is the East Coast, and this is the Gulf Coast region. And that makes sense that there's an area off our coast where we have the rights to those resources. But remember, Alaska is also part of the United States, so this is an area that we claim as part of our EEZ, our economic zone. We have over here, these are U.S. territories. Well, these are states. This is Hawaii, but the rest of these are United States territories there. Okay, all right. Now, specifically, you usually think about fish when you take a look at the economic resources of the ocean. The ocean shelf is biologically the richest part of the ocean, including a major portion of commercial fisheries. You can see here's some big numbers. Here's the big number to know, $212 billion worth of sales in 2016. So if you also take a look down here, you can see that the states that contribute the most to this national total is California at 25 billion in fish sales, and then over here Florida, look at that, 28 billion. These other states here do contribute and have a significant amount of their resources are from fish, but they, as far as their percentage of the national total, not so big. Unfortunately, Louisiana is not what you thought it would be, but it is you know, less than 2 billion, but it is at 2 billion. It's a significant amount of money, and when you think about it. All right, so continental shelf. Now, in the continental shelf, what you have is the temperature is fairly, it's warmer than it is down here. There's this, you have all the mixing of the cold water and the warm water here, and you have the water that's very close to the surface, and it's getting hit by the sunlight. So this area here has a temperature that is cooler. Now, and this map is where this cross section is a little misleading because it looks like it's really, really shallow, and you can't walk out there. This is 200 meters, you know, that's, which is what, about 600 feet. So that's deeper than you can probably imagine, but that's what the continental shelf is. And there's the slope and the rise. This is the break when the angle changes very rapidly, but then this is called the slope. Now, to remember, here's the slope and the rise. If you're at the very bottom of the ocean and approaching a continent, if you were walking along the bottom, it would start to rise. And so the rise comes before the slope. If you were trying to ascend this, and then the shelf, just like a shelf where you put your toilet paper on in the bathroom, well, that's at the flat surface. So this is continental shelf. It's fairly shallow, it's close to the surface, and it is fairly flat here compared to these other geologic features here. The temperature fluctuates more because the water is shallower than in the deep sea, and because waves and currents keep the water circulating. The warm surface waters mix readily with the rest of the water column, so all this stuff is getting mixed up. And over here, this is the warm part of the ocean, out in the open ocean, and this part is really quite cold. All right. Turbidity is also a factor. It says here, water turbulence from waves and surface currents keep the water column well mixed. That is to say, in the continental shelf region, with generally no stratification or layers. This affects not only water temperature, but the available nutrients as well. Nutrients never have a chance to sink to the bottom and become unavailable as in the deep sea. So, so that's a good thing for the organisms that live in the water, that all that stuff is getting mixed up, because you need nutrients in order to have organisms grow. What comes to mind are different types of macroscopic algae, big plants that are classified with the algae because of their cellular structure. Things like seaweed, like the giant kelp, like Lamina, oakweed. So these are different plants that are affected by the turbidity of the water, and both of these seaweeds need a significant amount of nutrients. So that that mixture of nutrients is happening in the continental shelf region of the ocean because of the mixing of the water that happens because of the constant movement. Right, speaking of nutrients, here's a slide specifically on nutrients and showing you that in the bottom parts of the ocean, what you have is these nutrients will sink down and get stuck on the bottom. It's places like off the coast of Chile, where you have what's called upwelling, and the water from down here is being pushed up because it's moving over here in our picture to the right. And when it starts to move to the right and it encounters the continental rise and slope, then it starts to move upwards. And that's why you have the word there, upwelling. And so the nutrients move up there, and then they can become part of the organisms. The organisms that live up here can incorporate them into their metabolism and then into their bodies. And so all of the, well, not all, we'll see later in a different talk, but most of the organisms are living very close to the surface here. And so the nutrients need to come up in the deep part of the ocean. Now in the in this part, specifically in the continental shelf region, though, you're going to have not so much that, but what you have is you have an open system where you have nutrients that are coming in from different places, from things that are dying off, from estuaries and rivers that are dumping their soil into the area, and it comes down the river, and then right when the river meets the ocean, it kind of spreads out a little bit and then becomes part of this continental shelf area. And then it says nutrients from detritus originating in other communities. These are continental shelf areas close to right next to the continents. So when things die off on the continents, if they don't, if those dead things, those dead organisms don't go directly into maybe it's an estuary off of the continental shelf, or mangrove forest, or a seagrass meadow inside of a delta region. Whatever you have there, you're going to have organisms, mostly plants, from other areas that are going to be breaking down and going and being part of the nutrient spectrum of the specific continental shelf ecosystem there. All right, so there are, speaking of specific areas or communities, there are different communities that are found in the shelf regions of the ocean. We have the soft bottom and the hard bottom. We have the seagrass and the kelp forest. So we're going to take a look at those. Let's take a look at the soft bottom subtitle first. The soft bottom subtitle communities made up of infauna, epifauna, meofauna. The meofauna, remember, are organisms that are inside of the soil, and many of them are microscopic, but some of them aren't. Like clams are meofauna, and they are living in there. And the thing is, when these organisms move through whether it's mud or sand, then they are opening up holes possibly, or at least mixing up the sand so that oxygen can go through. All right, most of these organisms are going to have some type of movement, because they're the ones that are trying to stick in one place. You might find those in an intertidal area, or even a hard bottom subtidal community, but in the soft bottom, there's nothing to hang on to. So it says here, sessile species that don't move are rare due to lack of hard substrates or lack of hard things to latch onto, like rocks. There are more species present in the area than in the adjoining intertidal, but the distribution is often patchy. That means that the intertidal area, those organisms are specially adapted to live outside of the ocean, live in the air for hours at a time. And so there isn't there's just a smaller number of actual species that do this. But when you get to the subtidal, that means they're all still in the ocean. Well, with a soft bottom, then you're going to have more species than the intertidal, but these guys are going to be distributed not equally because there is a competition for resources in the soft bottom subtidal communities. Very few primary producers, seaweeds and plants, are the main primary producers in this type of environment in the continental shelf region. But there are microscopic protista called diatoms, and those live on particles. So that represents some of the food in this area that become part of the food chain and the nutrient cycle of this area. Alrighty. Remember, plankton is an organism that's floating around and not really on its own accord. It's going with the movement of the body of water, usually the ocean here. And it says larvae select particular bottom habitats to settle in, and several particular mechanisms are known, both abiotic and biotic factors. Now remember, abiotic factor is a non-living factor, and a biotic factor is a living factor. So, a living factor might be things like a predator-prey relationship. An abiotic thing might be the amount of oxygen that's available, the amount of sunlight that's available. These are abiotic factors. And so the larvae then, you can see in this picture all of these characteristics. These are abiotic characteristics, and these determine where the larvae are going to settle out. All right. Unvegetated soft bottom communities. All right. So we have infauna and epifauna. The infauna, many tube dwelling and digging species, polychaetes. If you'll remember from our study of marine worms, the polychaetes are segmented worms that have these structures that look like legs, look like arms, but they aren't arms. They're used for breathing. So the polychaetes, the mollusca are hard-bodied, soft-bodied animals with typically a hard shell, one shell, two shells. There are a few species that have no shells, like a squid or an octopus. Squid has an internal shell, some people say. In the soft body community with no vegetation, we have infauna. Epifauna are things like sea stars, brittle stars, the echinodermata in general. And then we also have organisms living on the bottom of these soft bottom communities. You may have seen different types of fish like stingrays or maybe some halibut that are living at the bottom of this area. And these are demersal organisms. And then here's a diagram that shows you some of that. And so here's some organisms living inside the soft body of the ocean. You can see the mixed up. There's some mollusks right there. There's a snail, univalvia. There's a bivalve soft-shelled clam. You can see some other ones here. Here's some different types of worms. Okay. All right. I think I mentioned meiofauna already, but meiofauna organisms that live in spaces between specimen particles, and many of these species are unique and found nowhere else. They're hard to find, though. We probably have another, oh gosh, I can't guess at the number, they say that there are 1.6 million different types of organisms that have been discovered and named, and And by taking a look at the mathematics of it, it looks like there may be 4 million species on Earth, or animal species on Earth, that we still need to classify. So, that means we haven't even discovered half of the organisms, and so different places, different parts of the world need to be studied more intently, and you may find some different organisms if you were looking around in the sand in the muddy bottoms, in the sandy bottoms of the continental shelf. If you take a look at this diagram here, there's all kinds of different things that you could possibly find. Some are animals, some are some are protista, protozoans, but some are actually even considered to be lower animals, lower invertebrates. Okay. All right, and then there are different jobs that different organisms have. Many species are deposit feeders, getting food deposited on the bottom, so they are waiting for things to die and then drop down. So they eat the detritus, the dead organism, whether it's a plant or an animal. Others are suspension feeders, especially in areas that are more turbid. They get food from the water. And then over here, bioturbators, burrow or digging animals that disturb bottom sediments. And these are useful, like the meiofauna. These are useful in that they mix up, they create opportunities for oxygen. They become part of the soil, the sand, or the soft bottom. And so these are, like in the picture here, like the clam, like in the previous picture, you saw clams and worms that make up a part of this. Fish that live at the very bottom. These are all different types of jobs that organisms have, being bioturbators, suspension feeders, or deposit feeders. All right, so I mentioned in the continental shelf area, there are different types of bottoms. There's soft bottoms, and then there are hard bottoms. Both of those being subtidal or always submerged in water below the low tide. But then there's also something called the seagrass meadow. And so you can see in this drawing, you can see that seagrass makes up an ecosystem. You have all these different organisms that can live on the eelgrass right here. Some of them may be microscopic, but others can be seen with the naked eye. Here's some green algae that live on the seagrass. The seagrass is not just one species. It is a higher plant. It's a flowering plant. There are over 50 species of seagrass. This one in the picture is called eelgrass, and you can see that in different parts of the United States, including Louisiana and off the coast of California. You see some seagrass meadows in the warmer southern parts. These seagrass meadows develop in sheltered, shallow waters with good water clarity, mostly soft sediments, so very much like an estuary region. There are different types of grass. Some are more hardy and more successful in warmer regions, and some can take a cooler temperature, like eelgrass. And so there's also a high diversity of species associated with seagrasses, and that's the main point of this picture. And you can see different types of organisms that actually live on the seagrass itself. So there you go. All right, now the density of individual plants tends to be pretty high, as you can see in this picture. That means the seagrass live next to each other. Each individual plants get crushed together. So this area has a high biomass, and because it has a high biomass and because it's close to the surface, the sunlight can come down and hit this seagrass, and then these guys can go through photosynthesis. So because they have the ability to do that, we say that they have high primary production their primary productivity is high. Different organisms then will feed off of these autotrophic organisms. That means that you're going to have grazing animals that will eat the seagrass. This includes big things like turtles, smaller things like the sea urchin, and so some organisms will eat the seagrass directly, but most of the biomass it goes through the few animals that are able to eat the seagrass, and so the seagrass becomes part of the chemical nutrient cycle when you have the death of even the seagrass, the death of animals and plants, and so remember, dead organisms are called detritus. So then detritivores would come and eat the detritus, and that is how the nutrients come back in the cycle. Seagrass, much like the mangrove forest, up a little bit higher in the estuaries, the seagrass helps us stabilize the sediments so that you don't get all of the river runoff, all the soil that comes down the river. You don't have that just washing away into the ocean very far deep into the ocean, but the seagrass helps to keep that in one place. All right, so here's a diagram that shows you seagrass community, and see at the bottom, starts at the bottom, just like in the energy pyramids for when you're taking a look at the different ecological pyramids, specifically the energy pyramid, and the different levels of energy, like the producers and the consumers, the second order consumers, and going on up finally to the top predator species. But that's the organization of this. You have producers, you have the seagrasses at the producers trophic level up here, but you have the urchins that are able to eat the seagrass, and then here are the turtles I mentioned eating the seagrasses. But when these guys die, they turn into the detritus. See, this arrow is a little bit bigger, so the seagrasses themselves die and they turn into detritus. And here are other organisms that live in the ocean that all contribute to the detritus. So other organisms are going to benefit when the breakdown of these chemicals occur. And so see over here, it says export to other communities. You have the deposit feeders taking that out, herbivores eating the seagrasses right there. So an interesting cycle in that if you see a trophic level diagram like this on the land, a lot of times you'll see all of the different levels contributing to the detritus part of the cycle, and then fungi and bacteria breaking that down. But here you see some animals, whether small or large, grazing off of the seagrasses, and all of that goes into the detritus pool. And then the all of the organisms of the ocean can benefit from the addition of nutrients to the nutrient cycle that way. All right, hard body or hard bottom subtidal communities. We looked at soft bottom ones, but the hard bottom ones have a rocky bottom instead of a sandy bottom. And so this is looks like Strongyocentris purpuratus, which is the purple sea urchin. And these guys are less common than soft-bodied communities. Um, uh, they are found off the coast of California when there is a much smaller continental shelf region, and so they can develop when the rocky shores are submerged below the low tide level. That's so an area can turn into from an intertidal tide pool type of area to, if the sea level rises either locally or globally, it can be submerged, and then you would have a hard bottom subtidal community. And so here's the cycle there, and then it's similar in the sense that you have all of these blue arrows going to the detritus cycle instead of the previous cycle where uh, we saw the seagrass. Well, these are the algae, which are classified differently. These are the seaweeds, the larger macroscopic algae, and then the phytoplankton are things like the green algae that are microscopic. These guys both contribute to the trapping of the nutrients and the capture of the carbon dioxide from the water, the sunlight energy. All this leads to the production of food. Um, and these guys are growing, and filter feeders will filter out all the plankton. Herbivores will feed off of these seaweeds, but everything dies off and becomes part of the detritus cycle, as you can see right there. And then other organisms can benefit because they feed off of the detritus there, or they feed off of organisms that can access the detritus pool once again. So that's the hard bottom subtidal food web right there. This one is the seagrass one, you can see, but it's very similar. And it's just that the producers will change out. But this has the phytoplankton and seaweeds here. And remember that phytoplankton are often called the pastures of the ocean, because it's thought that even 45%, almost half of all the photosynthesis that occurs is not, is actually from these unicellular green algae that are floating in the very top of the oceans and the rivers and streams and lakes, but mostly the oceans in the whole world. And so, in the 1990s, there was a problem with the slash and burn techniques in the tropical rainforest, and people are in uproars like, we're burning all the forests, and how are we going to get enough oxygen even? Some people are thinking. Well, you got to realize also that the forests are a little bit more than half the story, that the phytoplankton and single-celled algae also contribute to the amount of oxygen in the air, just like huge trees do. The last community I wanted to touch on is the kelp forest, and kelp is a macro algae. It's a large algae. These are multicellular organisms that are classified in the algae because of their cell structure. They have chitin as part of their cell wall. They have pigments, and their pigments actually help to classify them into different groups. You have the green algae and the brown algae. You also have the red algae. And so the red algae and the brown algae are actually probably people would readily use the term seaweed when it comes to the red and the brown algae. And here in this picture here are a couple of the laminaria, different types of laminaria. I've never seen this one here, but when I frequented the ocean a lot, I'd see a lot of laminaria right there. Not this particular species, but this one for sure. Brown algae are quick to grow. Look at this, 20 inches a day. That's this much. these guys can grow a lot. And depending on where they land, they can not land, but where they're floating, they might form a canopy at the very top, but they might form the basis of a layer right below. These guys are taking the light energy and turning that into parts, and so they have a high primary production. So here's the laminaria. Here's the ones I've seen. Kelp common in North Atlantic and North Pacific. One of the smaller species of kelp with maximum heights of around 3 meters, just 10 feet long. Where I used to live, we had a kelp forest off of the coast of California. And what was common there was macrocystis. This is the giant kelp, and these can grow so big, can grow over 100 feet long, mainly along the Pacific coast of North and South America. If you take a look at a map, you can see that Chile has a very similar type of water temperature and nutrient availability. We get in California, we get the temperature of the water comes down from the north towards the south. So that water is coming off of Alaska, coming down the Washington, Oregon coast. And so it's cooler water. It's not coming from the equator, it's coming from the poles. And the same is true in Chile. And so that both of those areas are known for their kelp forests. There are other parts of the world that have kelp forests, but not so many, because you need nutrient-rich water, but you also need a cooler water. So the kelp forest is not a common aquatic ecosystem, but it's one that's commercially and ecologically a very important aquatic ecosystem. Oh, and here's a map. And so here is in green, here you can see the west coast of the United States, and that's where I used to live right there. You can see Alaska, a lot of kelp forests as well. Here's Chile, right there. And then another big area here around New Zealand. That's where you can find the kelp forests. Here's a nice graphic that breaks down the different levels of the community that you would expect in a kelp forest. Here are the giant kelp down here that I just mentioned. Okay, sometimes you get a canopy layer floating on the top, but then you also have others that are down here. And so you have different levels of the kelp forest. Again, the kelp forest is a high productivity region with a lot of different species and a lot of different zones depending on what organism, what plant can be found right there. And so you also have sea urchins in here. These are important herbivores. What the sea urchins do is they'll crawl around the bottom and start eating the holdfast of these kelp. So you need to keep those sea urchins in check. And so one of the organisms considered to be important in the kelp forest is the sea otter, because when you have sea otters, what they do is they keep the sea urchins in check. If you take a look at this graph right here, shows you that the sea otter, number of sea otters for these 3 different areas is dropping. And so as the amount of sea otters dropped from 1985 to almost 2000, you can see the number of sea urchins went up. And the grazing intensity of the kelp went up because there are more sea urchins. And the kelp density went down because there's more sea urchins. And if you look over here, here's a pot of orca that are killing off the sea otters. And that means there's fewer sea otters. And then the urchins are able to reproduce without being eaten by the sea otters. And so those guys overgraze the kelp forest and eat up the holdfast, and these guys just go floating away. Over here, you see before, many sea otters, few sea urchins, and you have a richer, denser kelp forest. So if you take out sea otters from this community, it's a problem. And so that's why sea otters are known as a keystone species, because just like if you take out the keystone of an arch, and the whole arch drops and falls apart, just like you would do that. If you take the sea otters out of the environment, then the whole environment goes to pot, and you see that the kelp forest is disappearing. Alrighty, so those are some comments about the communities that are found in the continental shelf area. You have soft and hard-bodied subtidal communities. You have the seagrass, and then you also have the kelp forest. All these are specially adapted to live in the continental shelf region, which has a unique temperature pattern, a nutrient pattern. And so those are some things you need to be aware of, as well as the geologic characteristics of the area, in that they are close to the continents and fairly shallow. And the edge of the continental shelf region is defined as when the continental slope starts, when you have that shelf, the end of the shelf, and the angle of the shelf split increases tremendously. All right, so that is the continental shelf, and I hope you found something useful for you today. And this is Mr. Vallejo. Thanks for listening.